At about 9:40 on November 1st, 1755, Lisbon will begin to disappear. For now, the city is still breathing. Bells answer one another across the hills. Sunlight breaks across the Tagus. Market women arrange silver fish beneath awnings. Oars strike the water beside the quays. Inside churches, crowded for All Saints' Day, candles burn before gilded altars. Nothing announces catastrophe. Ahead stands a capital no camera ever photographed. Palaces, shipyards, theatres, hospitals, steep stairways, and roofs packed so tightly that neighbours can speak from one upper window to another. Before this morning ends, much of it will be impossible to recover. So we will not begin with ruins. We will rebuild Lisbon while it is still alive, and remain inside it as the final minutes of its old world run out. The Lisbon of 1755 is not the city visible today. The straight avenues of the Baixa have not yet been drawn, and Praça do Comércio does not yet exist in its familiar, symmetrical form. Between Rossio and the Royal Waterfront lies an inherited capital, medieval in its foundations, and repeatedly enlarged without a single controlling plan. More than 40 streets and around 70 smaller lanes coil through the valley. Some admit carts, others tighten beneath projecting upper floors until the sky becomes a pale ribbon above the crowd. Timber-framed extensions push houses farther over the roadway because space inside the old urban core is precious. Every room added above steals a little more daylight below. The result is not chaos, exactly. It is centuries of decisions compressed into stone, timber, shadow, and habit. At street level, shops open directly into the movement of the capital. Above them, families climb narrow wooden stairs towards dim rented rooms. Laundry hangs over animals, barrels, handcarts, customers, puddles, and mud. Workshops release hammering, sawing, shouting, and the scrape of metal into the roadway. A single doorway may lead to a merchant's office, a tailor's bench, a chapel, a warehouse, or a family sleeping behind its shop. Seen from the river, Lisbon appears white, red-roofed, and almost theatrical. Enter its lanes, and the same place feels compressed, smoky, irregular, and difficult to read. The old capital keeps two faces at once, one for the world watching from the river, another for those who must find their way through it every day. To understand why Lisbon grew this way, we must begin not on land, but on the Tagus. The river is its widest road, its front gate, and the source of its power. Near the capital, it opens so broadly that first-time arrivals may mistake it for the sea. Ocean-going ships anchor away from shore. Smaller boats move constantly between them and the quays, carrying passengers, letters, timber, stone, food, barrels, rope, and guarded cargo. The waterfront is not one graceful promenade. It is a working chain of beaches, landing places, repair yards, warehouses, customs points, markets, and muddy edges. Each section has its own rhythm, labor, and smell. To follow the riverfront is to watch the city's entire nervous system exposed. Here, the Portuguese Empire becomes physical. Sugar, tobacco, leather, cocoa, dye woods, gold, and diamonds arrive from Brazil. Ships bring ceramics, silks, spices, and luxury goods connected to Asian trade. Textiles and manufactured objects come from Northern Europe. The cargoes glitter in inventories, but the machinery moving them is less glamorous. Clerks bent over columns of figures, customs officers checking seals, porters racing the tide, sailors waiting for pay, merchants calculating risk in several currencies, and guards watching warehouses whose contents may represent a fortune. On a map, empire is a colored shape. Here, it has weight, paperwork, delay, damp rope, aching shoulders, and the endless transfer of goods from hull to boat, boat to quay, and quay to city. Beneath that prosperity lies another truth. Lisbon's wealth is inseparable from colonial extraction and Atlantic slavery. People of African birth and descent are present throughout the capital, some free and some enslaved, working in domestic service, transport, craft production, street selling, and the port. They move through the same spaces as nobles, priests, soldiers, and merchants. Any reconstruction filled only with elegant carriages and richly dressed officials would be false. The polished rooms above the waterfront and the cargoes passing through the customs houses depend on unequal systems extending far beyond the horizon. Lisbon dazzles the arriving visitor, but its brilliance is built on lives experienced very differently. The light does not fall evenly. The riverfront opens into Terreiro do Passo, the palace yard. Today, this ground is occupied by the disciplined geometry of Praça do Comércio. In 1755, it is less uniform and more theatrical. A vast open space shaped over generations, with the Tagus forming its southern edge. Ceremonial boats land here. Foreign envoys step ashore beneath watchful eyes. Officials, soldiers, porters, petitioners, servants, nobles, laborers, and spectators cross the same expanse. The square belongs symbolically to the monarchy, yet it is never detached from the working city. Royal authority faces the river, while mud, cargo, bargaining, and manual labor remain only paces away. Power has built itself a stage, but the port keeps walking across it. Along the western side rises the Ribeira Palace, Lisbon's principal royal residence, for roughly 2.5 centuries. Its long facade stretches towards the water, and a monumental tower dominates the skyline. Yet this is far more than a royal home. Behind its windows are apartments, audience chambers, chapels, offices, galleries, collections, storerooms, and the daily bureaucracy of a global monarchy. Courtiers wait in antechambers, servants cross back passages, clerks prepare documents bound for distant shores. Decisions made inside these rooms may travel for months before reaching the people expected to obey them. The palace does not simply stand beside the machinery of government. Part of that machinery is turning behind its walls. The Royal Library holds tens of thousands of books. Paintings attributed to celebrated European masters hang in rooms closed to most citizens. Maps, reports, correspondence, and administrative records preserve the memory of voyages, treaties, taxes, appointments, and imperial rule. Nearby institutions, including the Casa da India, manage trade, revenue, communication, and parts of the Crown's overseas system. Centuries earlier, Portuguese kings had ruled from the Castle Hill. Now the monarchy has descended to the waterfront. The reason is visible from almost every palace window. Power no longer looks inward towards old fortifications. It looks outward towards sails, cargoes, and the ocean routes on which the kingdom depends. Beside the palace stands the newest wonder in Lisbon. The Ópera de Tejo opened on March 31st, 1755, only 7 months before this morning. Designed in the Italian theatrical tradition, it embodies the image the court wishes to project: refined, wealthy, modern, and connected to Europe's most fashionable culture. Inside, painted scenery and complex stage machinery can transform the world before an audience seated in decorated boxes. A palace can rise behind a curtain, a painted horizon can deepen the stage, and night can fall on command. Yet the building will survive so briefly that later generations will struggle to reconstruct it. Plans and descriptions reveal its scale, while some colors, finishes, and ornamental details remain informed possibilities rather than certainties. Lisbon's newest illusion is already becoming one of its hardest buildings to remember. Move west from the palace, and ceremony gives way to industrial sound. At Ribeira das Naus, the riverfront is shaped by naval labor. Timber is measured, cut, lifted, and fitted. Ropes strain beneath heavy loads. Hull seams are sealed. Masts are prepared. Pitch, salt water, smoke, and wet wood thicken the air. Portugal's most dramatic age of oceanic expansion belongs to earlier centuries, but the infrastructure that made maritime power possible is still active. The workers here do not see a ship as a heroic silhouette against the horizon. They see thousands of parts that must survive Atlantic weather, protect cargo, carry food and water, endure months of stress, and return with profit rather than loss. At the edge of empire, grandeur begins as calculation, craftsmanship, and exhausting repetition. Turn east, and the riverfront changes character again. Ribeira Vela, the old waterside market, draws boats close to its stalls. Fish, fruit, vegetables, and other goods move from baskets to tables beneath arcades and temporary awnings. Women dominate much of the small-scale selling. Sardines flash in the morning light, while buyers bargain and porters force a path through the crowd. Bakers, washerwomen, servants, water carriers, fishermen and craftsmen share the same compressed ground. Rank remains visible in clothing, posture, and privilege. Yet the market pushes separate worlds into contact. Nearby, the diamond point facade of the Casa dos Picos catches the sun, a rare surviving clue to the vanished texture of this shore. One building remains. The crowded world around it does not. From the river, the ground rises sharply into Alfama. Streets tighten, twist, climb, and suddenly break into stairways. Their roots preserve the memory of earlier cities, the medieval Islamic settlement, the Christian conquest of 1147, later rebuilding, changing property lines, and generations of practical adaptation to the hill. Small houses press against churches, courtyards, retaining walls, fountains, and passages barely wide enough for two people to pass. A turn of only a few steps can hide the river, reveal a chapel, or end at a wall built by another century. The plan is ancient, but life inside it is not frozen in the Middle Ages. In 1755, Alfama is crowded with 18th century trade, poverty, devotion, domestic labor, argument, music, and gradual change. Above the district stands the cathedral, the Sé, massive and almost fortress-like. By this year, it has already endured centuries of alterations, repairs, and earlier earthquakes. Its Romanesque facade, towers, chapels, and later additions do not belong to one pure architectural moment. Almost no major building in Lisbon does. Each is a layered record of damage, fashion, patronage, ritual, and survival. Stone from one period supports work from another. A chapel may be rebuilt, while an older wall remains hidden behind it. The cathedral is therefore more than an old monument. It has survived by repeatedly becoming something new. Sacred buildings crowd the capital. Churches, convents, monasteries, chapels, brotherhoods, processions, and bells organize the rhythm of the year. Religious institutions own property, educate, distribute charity, sponsor music, shape ceremonies, and influence movement through entire neighborhoods. On this morning, their presence is stronger than usual. November 1st is All Saints' Day, one of the most important feast days in the Catholic calendar. Families dress for Mass. Altars glow, incense hangs beneath painted ceilings, candles burn in churches and private chapels. Streets empty into doorways, then fill again as services end. Later accounts often compress Lisbon's entire population into churches at the moment of the disaster. The reality is more complex. People are spread across homes, markets, ships, workshops, streets, hospitals, palaces, convents, and public squares. We cannot recover the exact location of every person. What can be stated with confidence is that the feast changes the city's routine and places large numbers of worshippers inside religious buildings during the morning. It also leaves Lisbon filled with open flames at the very moment when roads, water access, and buildings will become most vulnerable. The danger is already present, but no one yet knows how the separate pieces will connect. Climb higher, toward the castle of São Jorge. By 1755, it is no longer the principal royal residence. The court abandoned the hill for the River Palace centuries earlier. Yet no place offers a clearer view of the city we are reconstructing. From the walls, Lisbon becomes a dense river of terracotta roofs descending between hills. Alfama lies to the east. The low city stretches towards Rossio. Bairro Alto rises to the west. Church towers break the roofscape. Beyond them, the Tagus burns with reflected light and moving sails. From this height, the capital appears coherent, almost orderly. The illusion vanishes as soon as we descend. Lisbon is built from abrupt contrasts. Noble households occupy palaces furnished with carved wood, imported porcelain, silver, paintings, textiles, and rare materials. French fashion influences elite dress. Music, formal visits, opera, private chapels, and everlasting meals display status. Only a short walk away, laborers and poor families crowd into fragile rented rooms. Palaces stand beside workshops. Convents border shops. Wealth is concentrated, yet daily life remains tightly interwoven. The city does not separate privilege from poverty with modern distance. It places them on the same street. Water is one of Lisbon's oldest and most persistent problems. Wells and fountains cannot easily satisfy demand, so carriers deliver what many households cannot obtain directly. Then, in 1748, only 7 years before this morning, water from the Aguas Livres system begins reaching the capital. The aqueduct carries spring water by gravity from northwest of Lisbon, crossing valleys on monumental stone arches before feeding reservoirs, galleries, and fountains. The network is still developing. It has not replaced the older culture of water carrying, nor has it solved every shortage. But it has altered what the city believes engineering can achieve. Stone channels now bring distant springs towards neighborhoods that once depended almost entirely on local supply and human labor. Across the castle slopes and crowded inner districts, the city folds towards Rossio. If Terreiro de Passo is the ceremonial stage of monarchy and empire, Rossio is Lisbon's public room. The square is broad, irregular, and constantly in motion. Coaches, carts, officials, servants, clergy, sellers, travelers, workers, patients, and spectators cross it in shifting patterns. Announcements, celebrations, punishments, religious ceremonies, and ordinary trade all belong here. The later facades familiar today do not yet frame the space. Instead, one immense institution commands the square: the Royal Hospital of All Saints. The hospital was founded to gather many smaller, charitable institutions into a single complex. By 1755, it has served Lisbon for more than 2 centuries. Behind its facade lie wards, kitchens, storerooms, a pharmacy, offices, a laundry, staff quarters, and areas intended for different forms of care. It is a medical institution, but also a religious, charitable, and administrative world with its own rules and hierarchy. Fire has already damaged it more than once, including a serious blaze in 1750. Repairs have returned much of the complex to use. Its name now creates an almost unbearable coincidence. The Royal Hospital of All Saints will be destroyed on All Saints' Day. Near Rossio, the Dominican Church of São Domingos draws worshippers. Institutions of royal justice and the Inquisition stand not far away. Their presence prevents us from imagining Lisbon as a simple Enlightenment capital, moving smoothly towards modernity. Religious authority, censorship, inherited privilege, scientific curiosity, commercial calculation, courtly display, and reformist ambition coexist uneasily. New ideas arrive through books, travelers, diplomats, merchants, and officials, while older power remains embedded. Lisbon is neither a medieval relic nor a fully modern city. It is an old urban organism carrying a global empire while trying to change without losing control of itself. West of Rossio, the ground rises through Chiado and towards Bairro Alto, where noble houses, convents, workshops, gardens, and rented rooms share the slope. Streets open, narrow, and open again. Beyond the dense center, the city gradually loosens into estates, country houses, walls and roads. Farther west lies Belém. King José I and members of the royal family have gone there after an early mass. They do not know that their distance from the center will save the dynasty from the first collapse. An ordinary decision has moved the crown away from the capital's most vulnerable center. Return now to the waterfront, because the Lisbon we have reconstructed is entering its final minutes. Nothing has stopped. Bells continue to travel across the hills. Kitchens remain active. Candles burn before altars. At the opera house, painted scenery waits behind the stage. In the palace, books, maps, furniture, paintings, archives, and ceremonial objects remain exactly where they were left. At the shipyard, tools lie beside unfinished work. Coins change hands at Ribeira Palace, while Rossio's hospital receives patients. Fresh water moves through the aqueduct. The future is present in every fragile object, but invisible to everyone touching it. Lisbon is not preparing to become history. That knowledge belongs only to us. At approximately 9:40, the first violent movement begins. No instrument records the earthquake. Its magnitude must therefore be estimated from written testimony, the geographic extent of damage, tsunami evidence, and modern geological analysis. Published estimates commonly place it around magnitude 8.5 to 9.0, with some recent source models producing narrower values within that range. The exact offshore fault system remains debated. Eyewitnesses describe several major phases of shaking, separated by brief intervals, and many modern summaries organize the sequence into 3 principal shocks, lasting several minutes. The sequence cannot be timed with the precision of a modern seismograph. Inside Lisbon, none of that uncertainty matters. What matters is simpler and far more terrifying. The motion is prolonged, repeated, and beyond what much of the city can withstand. The ground does not move once and settle. It continues long enough for walls weakened by the first shock to fail during the next. Masonry opens along old joints. Roofs collapse inward. Towers sway, crack, and lose support. Heavy facades fall towards streets already too narrow for escape. Dust rises until familiar routes dissolve into a pale, choking confusion. We do not need to describe individual suffering in detail to understand the scale of the transformation. Lisbon's systems are failing at the same time. Housing, worship, medicine, government, storage, transport, trade, and communication. A city built through centuries is being dismantled in minutes. Even so, the destruction is not uniform. The low central districts suffer catastrophic damage, while some buildings and neighborhoods on firmer or higher ground fare better. Alfama is struck, but retains more of its older street pattern than the Baixa. The cathedral survives in damaged form. The Aguas Livres aqueduct remains largely standing, its great arches enduring a shock that brings down newer and more ornate structures elsewhere. Castle walls, churches, convents, palaces, warehouses, and homes experience different outcomes according to location, construction, earlier alterations, and chance. Lisbon does not become one uniform field of rubble. Ruins, survivors, blocked routes, and open spaces exist side by side. People move toward ground that appears clear of falling walls. Large squares, and the waterfront seems safer than the narrow streets. Then the Tagus begins to behave in a way few can understand. Accounts describe the water withdrawing and exposing areas normally submerged. Sources disagree about the exact interval before the waves and about local wave heights. Models based on different possible earthquake sources do not produce one uncontested sequence. Yet the central event is secure. A tsunami enters the estuary after the shaking and surges into low waterfront districts already crowded with people, wreckage, cargo, and damaged boats. The open waterfront that appears to offer refuge is about to become another trap. Terreiro do Passo, the symbolic heart of Royal Lisbon, becomes one of its most dangerous spaces. Water crosses ground used only minutes earlier for ceremony, trade, travel, and daily labor. Boats are lifted, driven against structures, or torn from their positions. The palace complex, customs institutions, warehouses, naval facilities, landing places, and nearby buildings suffer a second form of devastation. The river that created Lisbon's wealth now drives destruction into the spaces built to receive it. And still, the city's transformation is not complete. Fires begin in multiple districts. Their sources were probably numerous: domestic hearths, kitchens, lamps, workshops, and the many candles burning for the feast. Roads are broken or blocked. Fountains and pipes are damaged. Buildings collapse across routes that might otherwise have carried help. Access to water becomes uncertain precisely when water is needed most. Separate fires spread through roofs, interiors, storerooms, furniture, and timber structures, then merge into larger fronts. Wind and heat carry sparks beyond organized response. The burning continues for days. By then, the disaster is no longer a sequence of separate blows. Earth, river, and flame have become one continuous destruction. The Lisbon that stood at sunrise is overwhelmed by three forces acting in sequence and overlap: earthquake, water, and fire. The new opera house disappears after only months of use. The Ribeira Palace is lost with its apartments, collections, archives, library, maps, and ceremonial spaces. The Royal Hospital of All Saints is ruined. Churches, convents, homes, workshops, warehouses, records, and works of art vanish. The disaster extends far beyond the capital, affecting other regions of Portugal and reaching the coasts of Spain and Morocco. The event is remembered as the Lisbon earthquake, but Lisbon is only the most famous center of a much wider catastrophe. Exact death totals remain uncertain. Records are incomplete. The population of the city is not known with perfect precision, and later retellings sometimes repeat or enlarge earlier estimates. Claims vary widely. The most responsible conclusion is less theatrical but more honest. Many thousands die in Lisbon, and many more lives are permanently altered. Families lose homes, work, records, networks, and familiar streets. Institutions that organize daily life disappear almost at once. The capital that emerges from the disaster will not be the city that entered that morning. Yet old Lisbon does not vanish completely. Alfama's lanes survive. The cathedral endures. The aqueduct remains. Fragments persist on the hills and beneath later construction. Property documents, parish boundaries, street names, maps, paintings, azulejos panels, eyewitness testimony, administrative records, and archaeology preserve pieces of the lost capital. Reconstruction is possible not through one perfect surviving blueprint, but through thousands of overlapping traces. One source supplies a street, another a facade. A surviving building clarifies scale, while an account preserves movement, sound, or use. No fragment is complete, and some disagree. But together they allow the vanished city to regain depth. Evidence does not resurrect everything. It gives absence a shape. While aftershocks continue, emergency government begins. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the king's most forceful minister, and the future Marquis of Pombal, emerges as the central organizer of the response. Later tradition attributes to him a famously concise command about caring for the dead and feeding the living. Historians often warn that the polished phrase may be apocryphal, refined after the event into the perfect summary of decisive leadership. His documented actions need no legend. Authorities organize food and water, create shelter, clear routes, control prices and rents, maintain order, gather information, and force the state to treat the ruined capital as a problem that can be measured, administered, and solved. Amid smoke and aftershocks, government begins converting catastrophe into lists, orders, surveys, and decisions. Within weeks, the question changes. Lisbon has survived the morning, Now the Crown must decide which Lisbon will be allowed to return. Chief Engineer Manuel de Maia presents alternatives. Some would preserve more of the old street pattern. Others would rebuild the lower city according to a radically different plan. Restoration competes with transformation. The government chooses transformation. The maze between Rossio and the waterfront will not be recreated. In its place will rise a rational grid of wider streets, standardized facades, regulated building heights, coordinated public spaces, improved infrastructure, and structural methods intended to reduce vulnerability to future shaking and fire. The disaster opens an urban experiment that would have been almost impossible the day before. One of the most famous features associated with the reconstruction is the internal timber framework, later known as the gaiola, the cage. Its exact development, chronology, and use varied, but the underlying principle was clear. Masonry buildings should contain a more flexible wooden structure and follow controlled proportions, rather than repeat the weaknesses of the destroyed city. Accounts also describe structural models being tested through coordinated marching or stamping to imitate shaking. The details of those demonstrations must be treated cautiously because later retellings may have sharpened them. But they express a larger, well-supported truth. Lisbon will no longer rebuild as though the ground beneath it were guaranteed to remain still. The future Praça do Comércio will occupy the Royal Waterfront, yet the Ribeira Palace will not return. Ground once dominated by the monarchy will be renamed for commerce and enclosed by regular facades. Rossio will remain one of the city's major anchors, though the buildings around it will change. Old property claims will be surveyed, negotiated, and reorganized beneath the geometry of the plan. Streets will widen, frontages will align, drainage, foundations, fire breaks, and standardization enter the new urban logic. The rebuilt lower city will eventually stand as one of Europe's most influential responses to catastrophe. But every plan for a new city is also an act of selective memory. Some institutions return in altered form. Others move. Certain names survive even when the streets they once described do not. Entire routes disappear beneath new blocks. The rebuilt Lisbon becomes famous for order, but that order is achieved by deciding which parts of the old capital will not be restored. The new grid is therefore both an answer and an erasure. It protects the future by refusing to reproduce the past exactly. This is the deepest paradox of Lisbon in 1755. The earthquake does not merely destroy one city. It divides Lisbon into two versions, occupying the same ground. One is the capital we can still enter. Pombaline streets, later squares, reconstructed churches, surviving hills, and fragments from earlier centuries. The other exists through evidence alone. The palace tower reflected in the Tagus, the new opera house with painted scenery waiting behind its curtain, the royal hospital dominating Rossio, the old riverside market, and the shadowed lanes where upper floors lean toward one another above the crowd. Return then, one final time to the Tagus before the first shock. The palace tower trembles only in its reflection. Market voices drift along the shore. A ship is being repaired. A carriage crosses Terreiro de Passo. Somewhere inside the opera house, painted architecture waits in darkness for the next performance. Somewhere in Rossio, the hospital doors open for another patient. In a church, a candle is lit. In a narrow street, someone leans from an upper window to speak across the lane. These are not symbols to the people living them. They are ordinary moments. No gesture, sound, or shadow suggests that this version of Lisbon has only minutes left. Now place that same ground beneath modern Lisbon. The palace has vanished, but the great square still faces the water. The tangled lower city is gone, yet the capital still descends between the same hills. The Tagus still controls the light. Alfama still resists the grid. The rebuilt city altered its streets, architecture, institutions, and understanding of risk. But it never escaped the lost capital beneath it. Every orderly Baixa block carries a decision made after destruction. Every surviving lane on the hills carries a pattern older than the catastrophe. The two Lisbons remain together, one visible, one reconstructed from what refused to disappear. We began with a city about to vanish. Reconstruction changes the meaning of that disappearance. Old Lisbon is no longer only a disaster measured in ruins, fatalities, and lost monuments. It becomes a living place again, full of labor, ambition, inequality, faith, beauty, noise, routine, and unfinished plans. Its streets can be followed from the Tagus to the castle, revealing why royal power moved towards the water. The market, the hospital, the shipyard, the palace, and the dark lanes beneath leaning upper floors return to their proper relationship with one another.
We can see what the earthquake brought down, what the waves reached, what the fires erased, and what the rebuilding deliberately chose not to restore. For a few minutes, the lost capital has returned. Subscribe and join us as we rebuild the next vanished city. The mystery that remains is not whether Lisbon can be brought back. It is how many vanished cities still lie beneath the one outside our own window, and whether, on their final morning, anyone could have recognized the world they were about to lose.